the butcher shop was still folded back when I walked in. That is the first image that stayed with me. Not my birthday flowers, because there weren't any. Not candles, not music, not anything soft or celebratory. Just white butcher paper on the counter, open like a prize, with 2 thick veal chops resting on a tray while Adrian stood over them with the kind of boyish pride people usually reserve for a car they just bought or a grill they just assembled. He looked up when he heard my keys, his whole face lit. "There you are," he said. "Don't look in the fridge. I've got your surprise." For one strange second, I actually felt relieved. Work had been ugly that day. My train had stalled between stops. My phone battery was down to 6%. I had spent the ride home thinking about how nice it would feel not to organize my own birthday dinner, not to answer the usual chain of texts from family, not to make decisions, just to come home and be cared for. Then I looked at the tray, then at the thick marbling, then at the cast iron pan he had already set on the stove, then back at him. "Veal?" I asked. He grinned and nodded like a magician waiting for applause. Not just veal. The butcher had these set aside. I asked him what he'd recommend if I really wanted to do something special. There are moments when disappointment enters the room so cleanly it almost makes no sound. It just changes the pressure in your chest. I put my bag down slowly. Maybe too slowly. Because his smile flickered. The thing about Adrian was that he was not careless in the loud way. He remembered anniversaries. He liked reservations. He sent screenshots of hotels we might stay in someday. He believed in gestures. That had always been one of the easier parts of loving him. He was a man who wanted to be seen as thoughtful. He liked the choreography of thoughtfulness, the reveal, the reaction, the satisfied little moment after, where he could watch you receiving something and feel himself reflected back as generous. What took me longer to understand was that those gestures often had him at the center of them. His taste, his preferences, his version of romance, his confidence that wanting to impress you was basically the same thing as knowing you. I do not eat veal. I have never eaten veal willingly in the 4 years we had been together. I do not order it in restaurants. I do not make exceptions for special occasions. The texture turns my stomach. The taste sits on my tongue in a way I can't ignore. He knew that the way you know someone's coffee order, or whether they sleep hot or cold, not as trivia, as ordinary knowledge accumulated by simply paying attention. There was even a running joke between us whenever his parents invited us somewhere old-fashioned and expensive. He would scan the menu for the veal, and I would say, "Every single time, you can have my lifetime share." So when I saw the tray on my own birthday, there was no room for confusion. It was not a missed detail. It was a fact standing in my kitchen under bright overhead lights. He must have read something in my face because he laughed lightly and said, I know, you wouldn't have picked this yourself. That's why it's a surprise." I stared at him. People reveal entire worldviews inside little sentences like that. That's why it's a surprise. As if the value of a gift lives in how forcefully it departs from the person receiving it. As if your job, standing there with your work bag still on your shoulder, is to be educated into gratitude. I said, "Adrian, I don't eat veal." He waved a hand. "Not usually, but this is different. It's from Beller's." I actually laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because my body needed some way to release the disbelief. The sentence felt absurd in the room between us. As if quality could erase preference. As if expense could overwrite memory. As if the problem were that I had only ever disliked the cheap version of what he loved. He frowned. "What?" I asked how much it cost. He hesitated half a beat, then said, "That's not the point," which meant it had cost enough to become part of the performance. I looked at the butcher paper again, at the stamp on the corner, at the tiny tub of herb butter beside the tray, at the asparagus tied with twine like an extra in a commercial for a life no one really lives. He told me, finally, $112. $112 on a dinner he knew I would not eat. 2 weeks before, I had texted him a link to a cotton pajama set I wanted. Nothing dramatic. Blue with a thin white stripe. Soft enough to sleep in during the heat wave. $36 on sale. I sent the link because he had asked what I wanted, and because I had already learned that anything is fine tends to produce whatever version of me exists most conveniently in another person's head. He had replied with a heart reaction. That was it. Now he stood in front of my stove with his expensive surprise and looked wounded that I was not instantly transformed by it. I said, very carefully. Why would you make this for my birthday? He blinked, as if the question were unfair. Because it's special. That's not what I asked. A small silence opened. I could feel him trying to decide which version of the night he wanted to protect. The one where he was a loving boyfriend executing a memorable birthday dinner, or the one where I had already noticed that the dinner was built entirely around what he considered impressive. He settled on indignation. It is amazing how often that becomes the fallback when admiration fails to arrive on schedule. I spent all afternoon on this, he said. I went across town. I talked to the butcher. I planned the whole thing. You couldn't at least try to appreciate that? Try. That word landed hard. Not appreciate, not enjoy, not feel seen, try. As if my real obligation was to help him complete the emotional arc he had purchased for himself. I looked over at the dining table and noticed he had set 2 heavy wine glasses out, even though I had stopped drinking red months earlier because it gave me headaches. He had opened a bottle anyway, of course he had. It matched the meal. That was when the whole thing slid into focus. Not all at once, more like those little images that sharpen when you turn them under a lamp. The spontaneous tapas place he surprised me with on our anniversary because he had wanted to try it for weeks, even though I had already told him I hated standing room only restaurants where you had to shout to be heard. The weekend trip built around his favorite cycling route presented as quality time for us. The just because sweater and a color I never wore, chosen because he liked it on women. The movie marathons that somehow always landed on his comfort films and then got described later as our tradition. None of those incidents had seemed big enough on their own. That is how these things survive so long. Not by being enormous, by arriving in tasteful packaging, one manageable disappointment at a time. I said, you asked me what I wanted. He stared at me. I sent you the link. He rolled his eyes just slightly, which made me angrier than if he had shouted, I didn't want to get you pajamas for your birthday. There it was. Not I forgot. Not I was trying to add this on top. Not I made a bad call. I didn't want to. Some sentences are more honest than apologies ever get. I asked, so what exactly is this? He spread his hands, irritated now that I was making him explain the structure of his own kindness. A nice dinner. A real gift. An experience. I thought you'd be touched that I put in effort, instead of just clicking by. A real gift. The phrase almost made me smile, as if the thing I had asked for was too small, too plain, too lacking in cinematic value to satisfy his idea of what generosity should look like. As if comfort was somehow a lower form of love than spectacle. What he still did not understand was that the pajamas had not mattered because of the pajamas. They mattered because I had answered the question he asked. They mattered because being known is often made visible through boring details. The right tee. The right size. The right softness. The right thing on the ordinary list that says, I heard you when you were not performing. But a pair of pajamas would not have let him stand at the stove and feel like a man in an advertisement. A pair of pajamas would not have let him narrate his afternoon. A pair of pajamas would not have fed him the exact meal he was in the mood to eat. I realized then that the dinner was not only wrong for me, it was exquisitely right for him. And that was why it existed. I'm not eating that, I said. His face changed. Disappointment first, then disbelief, then that righteous hurt people wear when they think their intentions should exempt them from consequences. You are being unbelievably ungrateful. I almost said, ungrateful for what? For being ignored expensively? For getting front row seats to your self-congratulation? But I was tired, and tired people often become clear rather than eloquent. So I just said, you made yourself a celebration and handed me a seat at it. He scoffed. He actually scoffed. Then he said, that is so dramatic. Drama is another useful refuge for people who do not want to inspect their own behavior. If your reaction can be relabeled as excess, their action never has to be relabeled at all. He lit the burner. The pan hissed. He took the chops from the tray with a tenderness he had somehow failed to extend to the person whose birthday it was. The sound they made when they hit the skillet was immediate and aggressive, the whole apartment filling with butter and rosemary and the smell of something rich enough to impress dinner guests. I stood there for another 10 seconds, maybe 15, long enough to realize he was cooking them anyway. Not because he thought I might come around, because he wanted them, because the evening, in his mind, was still salvageable if he could finish the meal and remain the injured party. I opened the fridge. There was lentil soup in a glass container from the night before. I took it out and set it in the microwave. He looked over his shoulder at the beep of the buttons, stunned as if I had broken some sacred agreement. "You're serious?" he asked. I said yes. "What, you're going to eat leftovers on your birthday out of spite?" That word again, disguised in a new costume. Spite. Not self-respect, not honesty, not simple refusal. Only the ugliest motive available, because ugly motives are easier to argue with. I leaned against the counter while the microwave turned. I was no longer angry in the hot way. I was angry in the cold, useful way. The way that starts organizing memory, the way that begins to place old moments in their proper drawers. I thought about all the tiny revisions I had made to myself in this relationship. How often I had smiled at restaurants I did not choose. How often I had said, "It's fine," because the alternative was watching him sulk through the consequences of being gently corrected. How many times I had mistaken the effort he enjoyed exerting for actual attentiveness. The microwave beeped. I took the soup out, poured it into a bowl, found the heel of a loaf we had been pretending not to finish. He plated the veal beautifully, which almost made the whole thing sadder. He spooned the herb butter over the top, arranged the asparagus, wiped the edge of the plate with a cloth, sat down at the table alone. I sat on the window bench near the kitchen with my soup. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The room did not feel explosive. That was what struck me most. It felt clarified, like a mirror after steam leaves it. Then he said, "I can't believe you're ruining your own birthday over this." And there it was, the final flip. The person who had ignored me cast now as the person injured by my refusal to make the lie more comfortable. I took one bite of soup and said, "No, I think I'm finally seeing it correctly." He did not answer. Maybe because he knew exactly what I meant. Maybe because he did not. Some people move through life assuming impact should always lose to intention. If they can find a flattering sentence to describe what they meant, then everyone else is expected to live inside that sentence with them, no matter what actually happened. But relationships do not break only on cruelty. Sometimes they break on repetition, on the slow, draining experience of being translated into someone else's preferred story until you hardly recognize yourself inside it. I finished my soup while he cut into the second chop. He ate both. That detail matters to me more than it should, not because it was greedy, though it was, because it completed the picture. He did not lose his appetite. He did not push the plate away in shame. He did not suddenly understand. He simply continued, chewing through the evidence. Later that night, he told me I owed him an apology for embarrassing him in his own home. Our home, technically, though the phrase "his own" seemed to slip out before he could stop it. I noticed that too. I notice many things now. I slept on top of the covers in the blue t-shirt I wore when I got home, still thinking about the unopened browser tab with the pajamas I never received. The weirdest part was not that he bought the wrong thing. Anyone can buy the wrong thing. The weirdest part was how offended he became by being expected to know me, as if familiarity were an unreasonable burden. As if after 4 years, paying attention was somehow optional, but gratitude was mandatory. The next morning, he acted almost normal. That, too, was familiar. He made coffee, asked if I wanted any, mentioned a podcast, moved around me with the soft caution of someone hoping the previous night can be reduced to a mood if he behaves casually enough. I said no to the coffee. Then I asked him one question. If I had cooked you a mushroom pie for your birthday after you told me a dozen times that you hated mushrooms, would you call that thoughtful? He sighed like a man being dragged into pointless philosophy. That's not the same. Of course it wasn't. Because in his mind, the issue was never the mismatch. It was his right to define the gesture anyway. I didn't argue. I just nodded. And in that nod was something close to peace. Because peace does not always arrive as forgiveness. Sometimes it arrives as the end of confusion. I spent my lunch break that day making a list on the back page of a notebook. Not a dramatic list. Not even a breakup list. Not yet. Just moments. Gifts that fit him better than me. Plans presented as treats that required my adjustment more than my enjoyment. Conversations where my preferences were treated as raw material he could improve. I kept waiting to feel petty for writing it down. Instead, I felt steadier with every line. Patterns hate documentation. That may be one of the truest things I know. So much of staying in the wrong relationship depends on your willingness to let each disappointment float free from the others, to judge every moment alone, to treat each cut as tiny because you are not allowed to stack them. But once you line them up, they begin speaking to each other, and what they say is often very simple. This was not the first time. You were not hard to know. He just preferred himself. I do not know yet whether that birthday dinner was the beginning of the end or simply the first moment I admitted the end had been approaching for a long time. Maybe those are the same thing. Maybe most endings start not with betrayal in the cinematic sense, but with one undeniable object placed under good lighting. A receipt, a message, a reservation, a gift, something you can point to and say, there, that is the shape of it. That is what I kept trying not to name. For me, it was a veal chop on butcher paper, a beautiful meal I never asked for, a man waiting to be praised for giving himself exactly what he wanted. I used to think the saddest part of a relationship was being unloved. I don't anymore. I think the saddest part is being studied just enough to be useful and not enough to be known. Being close enough to share a home with someone, a bed with someone, holidays and passwords and grocery lists with someone, and still realizing that when the moment came to celebrate you, they reached instinctively for themselves. That was my real birthday gift. Not the dinner, the clarity. It tasted better than what he cooked.
Thank you for watching. If this story pulled you in, do me one favor. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so the next one finds you the moment it drops. Remember, nothing is ever just what it seems. See you on the next one.